Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. After that very absorbing session with the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, we will now turn to another subject that, as Abba said, is on top of the news recently. Ever since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, interest in Britain has soared across the country. Sunak is not only Britain's first non-white Prime Minister, but also the first British Asian of Indian ancestry and a practicing Hindu to become one. And at 42, Sunak is the youngest ever Prime Minister of the UK in over 200 years. But Sunak takes over at a time when Britain is at a critical crossroads. It is facing an unprecedented economic crisis. Its relations with the international community are still being redefined after its exit from the European Union in 2020. It also has to deal with the fallout of the Ukraine war, and as importantly for us, Britain's relations with India is at a promising but tricky stage. We are delighted to have with us Ellis, the British High Commissioner to India, to take us through some of these big questions that we have about the way forward for Sunak and the UK. Alex is a career diplomat and also a top expert in national security and international strategy, having served as Deputy National Security Advisor and Director General for the exiting of the EU. And he, with his broad perspective, will also touch on other international affairs. So ladies and gentlemen, let's give Ellis a very warm welcome. Thank you for being with us at the India Today Conclave, Mumbai. In a short span of time, you have seen 3 Prime Ministers. You've been here since the past 2 years almost. What has been the change that you've seen? Have you had a word with Rishi Sunak after he's become the UK Prime Minister, and what is your experience of dealing with him?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. Tough act to follow, I think, after the Chief Minister, but I'll give it a go. So, UK-India relationship, I think, and the partnership is one of continuity as well as change. It's true, we've been through some political turbulence. But the course was set as we left the European Union by the integrated review, which set up for a much deeper and higher ambition with India. There are some good reasons for that. First, it is a much more geopolitically tense world, much more competitive world. Secondly, we have some opportunities, having left the EU, on our migration policy, on our trade policy. And thirdly, there was definitely some chemistry between Prime Minister Modi ji and Boris Johnson, but what's interesting to me is that's continued through now with Liz Truss and now into Rishi Sunak as well. So I think we're very much on that course.
And you worked with Rishi before, when he was Finance Minister as well, or as we say in Britain, Chancellor of the Exchequer. What was your experience, and did he give you any advice on how to handle relations with India?
So first let me try and say, and please excuse my Hindi, which I will now inflict on all of you. Zarur ve Bharatiya mool or Punjabi mool ke hain aur Hindu bhi hain. Ye dil aur dimag पूरी तरह से ब्रिटिश है. आजकल मुझे बहुत खुशी है कि आजकल मेरे देश में मॉडर्न यूनाइटेड किंगडम में दोनों संभव हैं.
Excellent. That's more Hindi than I can speak.
Don't ask me another question.
No, but since you mentioned where his dil is, where his heart is, and that's England. You know, in the past there used to be this, what they call the Tebbit's test for loyalty, which is if you're watching a cricket match versus England and India in the UK, which side would the people of Indian origin cheer? And that had become a huge controversy. Do you think that particular thing has been set to rest with Rishi Sunak becoming the Prime Minister?
Rishi Sunak is British. I'm sure he's rooting for the English team. I think that what has happened is the concept of Britishness changes over time. If you look at the census figures just out in the UK, 16% of the population of England and Wales now born outside the UK. Actually, India is the number one place where people born outside the UK coming from. So it's a different sort of country to it was a generation ago. And I think it's a better country for it. It's able to attract talented people from all over the world. Investment as well, I'm sure we'll come on to that. So the concept of Britishness doesn't stay still. It changes over time, and I think it continues to change. And the extraordinary human relationship which exists between India and the UK, you can see it in political life, you can see it in academic life, you can see it in sport as well, means that it is a different country, and I think we benefit enormously from that.
Do you think his coming will improve race relations in India? I mean, in the UK, that's always been a question.
I think the UK, modern UK, is, as I've said, quite a diverse place. And I think that he gets to the top because he's a very capable man to lead a political party and therefore to be the Prime Minister of my country. And it shows how talent can thrive. That is the most important thing.
Now, his coming, I mean, does it mean that, we've asked that question even in India Today magazine, will he favor India or will he be more loyal than the king itself and actually proceed with India-UK relations more cautiously?
I even brought my copy with me just in case. That gets an applause from the India Today colleagues, surely. He's the British Prime Minister. He works for the interests of the United Kingdom as I do. Part of delivering for the United Kingdom is to have a deeper and broader partnership with India. Our Foreign Minister was here in this city last week, his first trip after being reappointed as Foreign Minister, and he said he could not see a world in which the United Kingdom thrived without India thriving. So there's a mutuality of interest there, which I think will get tighter over the next generation as India continues on its extraordinary ascent to be a developed economy by 2047.
Now, we've had negotiations for a free trade agreement with Britain. It was to be delivered by Diwali. It hasn't. Are you confident now of it moving quicker? What are the kind of holdups that you are there, and by when do you think we should have this agreement in?
A free trade deal delivers growth and jobs in both our countries. There's an enormous gain for both countries if we can manage to do it. Negotiations are always tough. We've actually got through the majority of the negotiations already. I always think of it like a long climb up a mountain. You know, we've been along the valley, we've walked up the valley, we've now got up to the base camp, and now we have to do the short and steep ascent. That's tough. It requires trust on both sides, but I think we've garnered that. We've actually got through the majority of the negotiations already, and now we're set up for the final ascent. So I think there will be a push, and the two Prime Ministers, when they spoke last week, almost immediately after Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, and they agreed this is one of the main aims for the next few months.
Which are the areas that are still sticky points?
I think any free trade deal comes down to balance. UK will want some access to the goods market of India. India is a country of high tariffs, not surprisingly, because its stage of development is different from the UK. UK has very low tariffs. We'll want more access to the Indian market for high-quality UK products, which I think would benefit Indian consumers. India would also like access to some bits more of the UK market and would like the temporary mobility of workers between the two countries. There's a big flow of people between India and the UK. So it'll come down to that. It's a bit around security of investment, where some British companies in the past, I should say, actually not under this government, have found difficulty where the government's taken retrospective tax and things like that, so we need to have some security around that. These are tough issues. The question is there the political will there? And I think listening to Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak last week, I felt there was that will there to try and do the short, steep ascent.
You were mentioning tariffs. Does that include Scotch whisky? Has that become a subject of debate, and where has that reached now? Importing it by India.
Both countries have products which they want to export more of to each other, and that benefits consumers in each other's cases. For example, some textiles and manufactured goods from India to the UK. We have some very good high-end products, some very good cars as well, and we want to be into the growing Indian market for sure.
I think one of the more contentious sort of points is this whole business of mobility and migration. You had the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who, when working under Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister, talked of Indians overstaying their visits, and she expressed serious concerns about a free trade agreement on the migration issue. What is the problem? And has that been resolved?
Okay, let's have a bit of audience participation. I need to get you back after listening to the Chief Minister. Hands up in this room who has been to my country, to the United Kingdom.
Okay.
I'm going to ask that table over the hell, what the hell have they been doing for the last 50 years? Why haven't they been to the UK as well? I think that tells you something. There is an enormous flow of people between the UK and India. Indian nationals top visas for students, overtaking China this year for the first time. For skilled workers, 45% of all skilled workers coming into the UK on a visa come from India, and for visit visas as well. And there's a good reason for that. The UK is an attractive place to study, it's an attractive place to visit, it's an attractive place to work. So that's the thing to keep in mind. There is an extraordinary flow. I would say if there's an issue, the issue is getting more Brits coming here to India to understand the reality of India today, because I think that there is huge opportunities to learn about India as well. So any migration policy has to balance openness and access with respecting the rules, and so therefore people who overstay or don't have a legal right to come to the UK, then there have to be policies which get them back to the country which they come from. That's true of India, it's true of any country as well.
Well, we did, India and UK did enter into a mobility and migration agreement in 2021, but reports say that it is very patchy. Now, why is that so? I mean, you were supposed to get it over by this year. What's the problem? What's holding it up?
The good news is I think that the patchiness has got a bit less patchy. That agreement is about exactly that, enabling the mobility of people between India and the UK, and at the same time allowing both countries together to tackle illegal migration, illegal flows. And actually the agreement was signed 18 months ago, and now I think we're getting to a much better phase of implementation. So I hope that will continue for the next few months, because it's to both our countries' benefits to have a flow of people between the two countries, talented people, temporary workers and so forth, who can actually know and offer something to the other country.
Now, is that a discriminatory policy in the sense that you all want only high-end professionals, you don't want other kinds of workers? Is that one of the complaints that the Home Secretary has?
Both countries, I think, have their migration policies. They both want to attract talented people. They both want to make sure that that is balanced by rules in relation to people who don't respect the law or who are not, don't have a legal right to remain. As I say, that's true of any country. It'd be true of UK, it'd be true of India and countries around the world.
Well, let's come to another issue, and I think that's where the Indian government has been highly frustrated. We have economic fugitives and others overstaying their visits in the UK. We have the case of Vijay Mallya, we have Nirav Modi. The Indian government has been making frantic efforts to get them, but somehow it doesn't seem to work. What is the British government doing about that?
The truth is, this is no longer a government matter. The Home Secretary, our Interior Minister, signed off the extradition of Vijay Mallya over 3 years ago. That is now a matter for the courts. Our Prime Minister, we are clear, we do not want the UK to be a place of fugitives. We want it to be a place where people respect the law. And all I would say is it's now an issue for the courts, and the wheels of justice turn slowly, but they do turn.
No, one of the things was to amend the asylum law, which permits them to abuse this kind of privilege that they have. Has any progress been made on that?
I'm not going to comment on issues which are genuinely for the courts, and that's where those cases are.
No, but this is a parliamentary issue to amend the asylum. Has there been any movement on that?
There's a separate question about what you do about asylum rights coming to the UK. That's an issue for the government to take cognizance of. The progress of the asylum bill, I'm not so sure about at the moment, but let's keep the two issues separate. There are extraditions, which the government's decided on, and there's issues still going through the courts, and then there is our overall approach to asylum. But what you see is a UK which, having left the European Union, actually has more control over its migration policy and has actually shifted its migration policy to the relative benefit of Indian nationals. That's a big change for the last 6 years.
And the other issue that has been there is the social security arrangement that's there. And there's been a lot of heartburn about the fact that no agreement has been reached and Indian business has to pay a much higher amount, and those who settle over there don't really get the benefit because the visas expire before that and they forfeit that social security deposit as well. Has that been sorted out?
So, first thing to say on migration is now there's been this huge increase in Indian students, and one of the reasons for that is they now have the right to work after they finish university, and a lot of people avail themselves of that right to work. It's very attractive, and that's why we're seeing this huge growth of Indian students in the UK. there's a separate issue, which is about paying into the UK social security system. An Indian temporary worker does not have to do that for the first year that they're in the UK. It's an important point to remember. After that they do, and if they stay for 10 years, then they get the benefits of that social security arrangement. That is a case not just for nationals from India, but for nationals from many other countries in the world.
Coming to a broader subject away from the UK, but looking internationally, Britain has supported Ukraine wholeheartedly in its effort. India has played a neutral game, has in fact bought oil from Russia, and has been silent on a lot of the resolutions in the United Nations. How do you view, or how does Britain view India's approach towards Russia?
First, let's step back and look what's happened. An autocracy has invaded its smaller neighbour. It had no grounds for doing so, it was totally unjustified, and you see the harm that is causing to people in Ukraine and to people all over the world. Look what's happened to energy prices, food prices, fertilizer prices as a result of President Putin invading Ukraine. It is an extraordinary thing to do. We had thought the days of territorial aggression of that sort in Europe were over, but they're not. That's part of the more contested, more geopolitical world which we all now live in, and which I think is one of the great challenges, by the way, for India as its G20 presidency starts soon. So that's where we are. I completely agree with the Indian statements when they've talked about the importance of respecting the UN Charter, territorial integrity, and the rule of law. And that's what we have to get to. UK has been supporting Ukraine in defending their own territory from an external autocratic aggressor. And we make no apologies for that, because we cannot allow autocratic coercion of a neighbour to flourish in this geopolitical world we're in.
Let's be more blunt. Is the UK disappointed by the Indian approach in the Ukraine war?
Bluntness and diplomacy don't usually sit comfortably together. We talk a lot to the Indian government about it. The Indian government obviously will be driven by its own interests and concerns. The relationship you want between the UK and India, the UK and any country, is one in which you can sometimes discuss quite difficult issues. You do it privately, you do it frankly, you understand each other, and you see where you can create poles of cooperation and looking forward. And that's exactly what happened when James Cleverly, our new Foreign Secretary, or 6 weeks Foreign Secretary, was here last week, had a long discussion with Foreign Minister Jaishankar, and that's what we'll continue to do. In the end, we cannot allow President Putin to thrive from invading his neighbours. That, in the end, is the point I always have in mind.
Given the impact the Ukraine war has had on energy prices, Britain is facing a huge crisis that's there. Don't you think it's time to bring an end in some ways, work out some sort of agreement that will end the war? Second, if we don't, I mean, it seems like the NATO countries and others are pushing it further, so is Russia, we might end up with a nuclear conflagration. Since you were a former NSA as well, do you see that possibility happening, and what needs to be done? Do you think it'll go nuclear?
Well, I mean, the fact that you're even asking the question is totally extraordinary. I mean, is this inside our imaginations? That an autocracy can threaten something like that? My great worry is that President Putin's regime is now playing terrible games. One day mentioning the possibility of nuclear, the next day, oh no, denying it. One day saying, oh, we're going to close the supply of grain. By the way, the majority of that grain goes to the poor people of the world, being blocked coming out of the Black Sea by President Putin. The next day saying, oh no, we'll join it again. These are not things to play with. These are deeply serious issues. And we cannot, collectively as a world, allow those sorts of games to be played. What we also see from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that it is a matter which affects the world. We've seen that, fertilizer prices, oil prices, energy prices, of course they're affecting the UK, they're affecting every country in the world. These are extraordinary things to do for no justification. And just on the point you mentioned the countries of NATO, and it's not just the countries in NATO, what they are doing, what we are doing, is allowing Ukraine to defend itself from territorial aggression, an invasion, pure and simple, a military invasion, unjustified, unwarranted, deeply harmful to everybody. And that seems to me the right and the sensible thing to do for the United Kingdom.
Now, moving to China, I mean, before the Ukraine war, China was the biggest threat. It hasn't receded. what is it that you would, and given the fact of our India's hostile relations with China, what needs to be done there? I mean, you have joined the AUKUS in the Indo-Pacific. What is the way to contain China or to handle China?
One of the fundamental shifts in the UK's foreign policy set out in the integrated review was the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. The good news for this city, for this state, as we were hearing from the Chief Minister, for this country, is you are in the middle of the great area of growth and dynamism for the next generation. There is this extraordinary opportunity which India has, I think, in the next generation, with a median age of 28, to do incredible things on development of the country. That's happening in India, but it's not just happening in India. If you looked at Indonesia as well, quite similar median age, great opportunity there. So it's the dynamism, but it's also the area, I think, of growing concern around security, including in cyberspace, at sea, not just on the land border. By the way, I think when any British diplomat speaks about India, it behoves me to remember that India has a long land border with China, and the United Kingdom does not. So there's a shared interest in having a secure and open Indo-Pacific, because I think the sea is particularly important, where a lot of the world's merchandise is flowing to and from Asia, Indo-Pacific, into some of the big markets in Europe and elsewhere. And that's something we're working on. We're working on it through defense and security. We're increasing the amount of joint training we do together. We had, sitting just off this city this time last year, our carrier strike group, our new aircraft carrier and the supporting fleet around it. And that was doing a big tri-service exercise with India, exactly to show that we together support an open and free Indo-Pacific. So the good news is you're in the area of great growth in the world. The bad news is it's the growth of everything, good and bad.
Well, I come to other bad news, and that is what's happening in Sharm el-Sheikh, the big environment summit that's on there, COP27, supposed to be the implementation summit. Huge disappointment over the fact that developed countries have not met their adaptation funds promises, and also the fact that loss and damage has not been honored so far. We've seen what happened in Pakistan, the kind of floods. We've seen climate change impacting developing countries the most. What's your big advice or takeaway from what should happen at COP27?
Climate change is just a threat and a problem for the whole world. For India, probably one of the countries most affected by climate change, actually is already. You look at what's happened to crop yields this year, and therefore to grain prices gone up in India. But it affects every country in the world. It affects my country as well. The tough news is dealing with a great global problem when you have increased global fragmentation and how you do it. And so that's why I was delighted that last year at Glasgow, Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, leaders from all around the world set the course for how do you prevent serious harm to our planet from climate change. They actually reached agreement on it. It was a great thing. As you say, now you have to implement it. And that is happening in different ways at different times. That involves huge amounts of money. Most of that money is going to come from private companies. The state can do some things, can leverage some money, but most of it's coming from private companies. And India should be one of the great recipients of that money, because India is going to go through this extraordinary energy transition in the next 25 years. The UK, to an extent, has done that. Now, the majority of our electricity is generated by renewables. Our emissions of greenhouse gases have gone down, almost halved since 1990, while our economy has grown by 75%. So it is possible. But to do that, we need to generate the money, and I completely agree. There needs to be more public money on the table. The UK supports. We invest actually through public funds in great companies based here in Mumbai. We just announced a big investment with Mahindra to develop Mahindra's electric vehicles. So there's a long way to go on that. But I think we're on the right course. Prime Minister Modi set India on the course for net zero by 2070 and for this incredible energy transition. I don't think we really realize what a big change this is going to be in all our lives, if we are serious about climate change, what it's going to do. But I think India, we can't solve the problems of the world without India. And India is the third biggest emitter, will be the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, just because of a very big population. It's actually low per head. And India can actually jump, on my view, leapfrog. I do not know how to say leapfrog in Hindi, by the way, so I'm not even going to try and say it. Has the ability to leapfrog technology. And that's what's happening already. Some of the British investments in India are in those new technologies. Interesting, some of the Indian investments in the UK are in exactly the same thing. How do you create efficient fuel cells? How do you create better solar power? So it's a very worrying thing, but it's also a huge opportunity, including for India's G20 presidency.
And since you mentioned G20, we've got 20 seconds to go for this session. India is to take over as president of the G20 in December 1st, the first time we're doing this. What is the kind of role India should be playing in the next year in world affairs? And what are the top priorities in G20?
India takes on the G20 presidency in a very tough time because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because of geopolitical competition we talked about. India has some big advantages. One, it is strong, it is big. It is actually a voice that can reach lots of different countries. It's setting its determination, its course, I think, whether that's on climate change, whether that's on development, whether it's on an incredible thing that's going on in this country, which is redefining the relationship between all of you and the state through the use of technology. Which I think India is way ahead of some other countries, and actually they can pick up a lot from India about how you do that. So it's a tough time to be doing it, but I think India is absolutely the right country to be holding the G20 presidency next year. And like any person from my country, we're supposed to be famous for our punctuality. So I'll leave it there.
Well, one last thing. Since you began speaking Hindi, maybe you could end speaking in Hindi. Maybe a song in Hindi which you like.
I did.
Two verses.
No, I wouldn't dare to do it, but I did. I went to a concert of A.R. Rahman, where I'd never heard Dil Se Re.
Wow.
And what a great song. What a fantastic performer that guy is, actually. It was, I won't try it beyond that. 3 words is enough, I think.
Alex Ellis, thank you very much for this session. Thank you very much, ladies and
Dhanyavad.
gentlemen. Let's give him a warm round of applause for this.